Hello and welcome to another Atypical Philosopher video with myself, Jonathan M.S. Pearce. This is a Ukraine War Update Extra where I talk about little nuggets and interesting things surrounding the war. I've done a frontline update this morning. Please check out that mappy one. But this is just general discussion points. Let's get stuck into it. So the first thing was, this was the spy chief from the UK, the head of GCHQ, which is kind of our MI6, MI5 military intelligence guys and girls, and they are they don't often say an awful lot in public, but this is his speech that came out yesterday before he actually said it. So this is Sky News reporting on that speech, and he had a few interesting things to say. The costs to the Kremlin are staggering. A lot of what he said is actually laying the groundwork for dealing with the China problem going forward, and you'll find a lot of this talk going on in America, because arguably the success that the US, NATO, and other allies of Ukraine are having in terms of putting sanctions on Russia and providing military assistance to Ukraine is giving China pause for thought and changing its strategies and alignments as well. So there's huge geopolitical ramifications to the war in Ukraine. But in terms of looking to the future, China is the main. If Russia hadn't done this, America would be mainly talking about China and not Russia, really, at the moment. That's where their kind of thoughts are and objectives are. So Jeremy Fleming, that's his name, head of GCHQ, will use a rare public speech today to say that Ukraine armed forces are turning the tide on the physical battlefield as well as in cyberspace. And the top intelligence officer will also talk about China, the main focus of his comments. So, there you go, that Beijing is seeking to exploit technologies in space and online in ways that could pose a huge threat to us all. So that's where they're at. I'm just going to highlight a couple of things he said, but he said that the Chinese Communist Party is learning the lessons from Russia's war in Ukraine, which has seen the UK and its allies hit the Russian economy with sanctions. He called decision-making by Russian President Vladimir Putin flawed following the failure to seize Kyiv in the first days of the war. Well, the whole thing was flawed because it was based on incorrect intelligence from Putin, to the point, and I've written about this in previous articles, and I think all my articles from back in April still absolutely hold at the moment, or at least almost entirely. So, there you go. Quote, "It's a high-stakes strategy that is leading to strategic errors in judgment," said Sir Jeremy will say, according to excerpts of the speech released on Monday night. So their gains, quote, "their gains are being reversed. The cost to Russia in people and equipment are staggering. We know, and Russian commanders on the ground know, that their supplies and munitions are running out. Russia's forces are exhausted. The use of prisoners to reinforce and now the mobilization of tens of thousands of inexperienced conscripts speaks of a desperate situation. They're fleeing the draft, realizing they can no longer travel. They know their access to modern technologies and external influences will be drastically restricted, and they are feeling the extent of the dreadful human cost of his war of choice." And that this is now a sliding door moment in history. That if we don't do something now, things could be a lot worse in the future. And I'm going to circle back round to this idea later. So the very last thing I'm going to talk about is a fascinating speech given to the EU ambassadors. The EU Ambassadors Annual Conference 2022 opening speech by the High Representative Josep Borrell. It is a really fascinating speech, in my opinion, and well worth dwelling on. So anyway, that's that. I'm going to move on to talk. So linking to what was just said there in terms of Russia are struggling to get munitions, supplies, etc., I'm going to refer you to a little excerpt from Ukraine the Latest, which is a Daily Telegraph podcast, and an on-the-ground reporter for the Telegraph in Ukraine called Roland Oliphant, and this is on 1.25 speed, so slightly quicker. If you're listening to me on QuickTime, he will sound a bit more chipmunky. This is what he has to say, and I think this is pretty interesting.
For a journalist, last week we went over the Oskil River to the, towards the front edge of the ongoing Ukrainian offensive, which is now probably no longer the Kharkiv offensive. It's becoming the Luhansk region offensive because they've crossed the border, and the administrative border, in several places. Pushing forward, we spent the day with the artillery section of a mechanized brigade out there and talked to the soldiers. And the kind of, it's the second time I've spent the day with an artillery unit in this war, and the first time was in May during the battle around Izium, when things were going pretty grim for the Ukrainians, really. And the change in mood is kind of remarkable. I mean, the sense of confidence that people have. So, aren't you worried about counter battery fire? We're always worried about counter battery fire, but right now the Russians are so concentrated on holding back our infantry. Their artillery is distracted, and so they're not answering us very often. This is a unit that had fought in the Donbass offensive in May and in June. I mean, they knew what they were talking about. They'd seen, they'd been up against Russian artillery that had just been, in their words, just dropping everything to just burn out an entire field, an entire forest. And they said that's just changed. Like, the Russians they've been much more careful with their artillery, much more careful with the number of shells they're firing. So the Russians are now trying to fire at specific targets, and they're not just wasting ammunition like they used to. They said the Russians are also sending over fewer drones. It used to be an absolutely constant presence. They've noticed that the number of drones coming over has dropped off. And there's, I don't know. I mean, yes, it's anecdotal. Yes, it's one part of the front where the Ukrainians have enjoyed success. It's not down in Bakhmut. But the sense of confidence and the sense that the tide has just so dramatically turned in this war was, it was palpable. So we did that, and then the other,
which is absolutely fascinating, in my opinion. And yes, as he admits, it is anecdotal. This is just one example of opinion of Ukrainian troops on the ground, artillery unit in a very long set of front lines, north to south, east to west. But I think it probably is fairly reflective of the situation now compared to a couple of months ago, which is the tide has turned. The HIMARS have made a huge difference. We've got ranged artillery that is improving the lot for Ukrainians, and the Russians are running out of munitions. They are running out of stuff, which is why they went to North Korea, why they've gone to Iran, why they're trying to get stuff off Turkey, even like body armor and helmets, and Turkey said no. Russia are in trouble, which is why they have then resorted to a bunch of long-range missiles, including S-300 surface-to-air missiles, to hit targets that should be hit with far more precision. And they are using imprecise munitions to do that, and arguably running short of them. This is going to be costing them to replace all of these missiles a huge amount, as I talked about yesterday. But it also shows that they just don't have the quality of munition. And this is something I'm going to come to talk about in a little bit when I talk about Excalibur projectiles, artillery rounds, and how there's this. So the idea is that, and this was a problem for the Russians right at the beginning of the war, which is, say, take the US. They use, I think it's 10% dumb munitions and 90% guided munitions. They've moved really heavily over towards guided munitions because they're more efficient. They might cost more to make, but war is also about public sentiment, right? This war is being fought on social media. So if you're hitting innocent civilians, the world knows about it. And Americans have realized this, so they're like, no, we want precision munitions, where even with our indirect fire of artillery, we want to be hitting stuff precisely. So that's where we're going to put all our research, and that's munitions we're going to use. Whereas the Russians are still using 90% dumb munitions and 10% guided, and now they've used up pretty much all of their guided stuff. And they're running much lower on their dumb munitions as well. In certain areas like Kherson can't get them. So it's a fascinating difference. Changing tack completely, but I will return to that idea. Here's Tim White saying, because the FSB are releasing a bunch of stuff, which is the Russian Secret Services, that said, making up stories about they've arrested a whole bunch of people that were going to do another terrorist attack, and they've arrested a bunch of people who were behind the Kerch bridge, so on and so forth. Do you trust them? No. But here they've released an X-ray showing the hidden explosives on the Crimea bridge lorry. So this is a Crimean Bridge lorry on the right, and here's the X-ray they say. So they did see it, but obviously it just got through somehow, and they can blame, because they love a blame game, so they'll just blame the people operating the X-ray machines. Apart from the, so here's a picture of the lorry. As you can see, it's got 2 wheels there, 3 wheels, and a spare wheel there. And here's the X-ray they took of that lorry. 1 wheel at the front, no spare tire. But here are all the munitions they used to blow up the bridge, and it's just laughable. It's laughable. Which IT guy are you getting to say, right? We want this lorry X-rayed, right? So I want that, but in an X-ray, and I want you to put a bunch of munitions in the back. Can you do that for me? Yep, sure, I can do that, boss. Yeah, no problems. Okay, here it is, boss. Look what I've done. I've done it for you. Okay, brilliant. Great, we're going to shove that out to the media. Straight away, debunked because Muppetry. So there you go. Talking about these missiles that hit all of the cities around Ukraine. The Ukrainians, and they do this in pretty much all their cities, just incredible. In Odessa, Mykolaiv, Kharkiv, and here in Kyiv, a missile destroys a road or a bunch of stuff, and then straight away they are paving it over, and they get the people out. The next day they're working on it, and this is usable. This is about the strength of the Ukrainians, but it is about them delivering a message back to Russia, but also to their own population to say, we won't let this disrupt our lives. Yes, a cruise missile has just created a huge crater in the middle of the road, but do you know what? By 5 o'clock tomorrow afternoon, that'll be sorted. Don't worry, guys, we're on it. I just think it's remarkable, absolutely remarkable and brilliant. I have to say. Okay, so Phillips O'Brien here, just giving the latest, or not himself, but the latest satellite imagery that we can get of the Kerch Bridge. And there's all this talk about how it's operational now, that the cars are going through, that the railway is able to be used, that this is what the Russians are claiming, and it just doesn't look like that's the case. And there's this to and fro between, the pro-Russian and anti-Russian sources talking about what state of repair the bridge is in, and it just doesn't look like it's quite where the Russians claim it is yet. He also talks about, Phillips O'Brien mentions the fact that 4 more HIMARS have arrived in time for the autumn offensive in Ukraine. That couldn't be more timely, especially as I said this morning, that they are likely to be they're amassing their forces in Kherson and Kremenna-Svatove Kupiansk offensive. So two offensive. They seem to be amassing their forces. They're going to need stuff like HIMARS to do their stuff. That's really good news for them. Right. Just a random thing on Ukraine Weapons Tracker. Welcome back, Ukraine Weapons Tracker. Took a couple of days off, but great to see they do such invaluable stuff, those two. The first photo of a German-donated Bürgerpanzer II armoured recovery vehicle. I'm just testing out my amazing German. In Ukraine. In total, 5 of these ARVs were already received by the Ukrainian army, with 10 more to arrive soon. Now, this is like, you hear about all these great tanks, great pieces of artillery, not great tanks, actually. We are not supplying the Ukraine with main battle tanks, MBTs. The NATO aren't doing that. They are getting Soviet tanks from Eastern Europe, but they are T-72s at best, generally. So they really do need some of the more capable tanks. But they do get a bunch of this stuff, and it doesn't get, the recognition it should do, because actually this stuff is hugely vital for doing, excavations or removing tanks or that are damaged and need a repair, get them out so that the Russians don't get hold of them, etc., etc. These are super important, but no one shouts about how wonderful they are. So I'm going to do that now. Armored recovery vehicle, bring it on. And they've got obviously a long history. That's what ARVs are in this case, and they do a whole bunch of different work. That is vital for an army to be on offensive and defensive. So that's great to see that nations are not just thinking in terms of the flashy flashbang stuff, but also the nitty gritty, real functional equipment that they're going to need. Okay, now remember I did a video talking about the different types of infantry fighting vehicles and armored personnel carriers and Russian tanks. That video was hopefully pretty useful for you. Well, this is a BMP-1, just to remind you. It is an infantry fighting vehicle, which means it's basically an armored personnel carrier. So it carries people, but it has a little turret on top often that can do a bit of shooting. Okay, so it's basically a light tank that's used to carry people. And the BMP-1 was designed, a long time ago, 1966 to present, right? And they are still using these. The Russians are using these, and the Ukrainians. And I'm going to show you an example of the Ukrainians using them. Now, these were designed to withstand radiation and to be amphibious to some degree. We've seen a couple of them stuck because they're so poorly maintained. The Russians have tried to use them to get across the river and they've leaked water and got stuck. So we've seen evidence of that, and I doubt they're particularly radiation proof these days. I mean, some of these are really pretty old. But here's no, not that one, not that one. Where have you gone? Sorry about that. Here it is. So this is first-person footage of a Ukrainian BMP-1 just crossing the water, and it's quite rare, and it's just interesting to see it in action. So here it is. I reckon this is pretty interesting footage. Quite a bit of speed. Now, I'm going to pause this. There's a couple of places. I talked to you about artillery not needing to have direct hits on vehicles because the shrapnel that fires off of an exploding shell and anything it hits can cause critical damage to other artillery units, to vehicles and whatnot. Here's an example of shrapnel absolutely, I assume, disabling this vehicle. Okay, so this is an example of shrapnel that has gone through this vehicle. Now, whether that happened after it was immobilized or not, I don't know. But that's just, I think, quite an interesting little snippet. Straight through the river, no problem at all. And they loved it on top as well. I think they were probably quite happy it didn't sink. Again, look at all the shrapnel. So again, and the tires would have been taken out. So when you have an artillery shell maybe landing, 10 meters away from this, 15 meters away, you think, I haven't got a direct hit. Oh, well, that's a wasted shell. No, the shrapnel can immobilize that vehicle, take out its tires and, rake through that cabin and kill the people inside or whatever. It's, you don't need a direct hit. And of course, you're also seeing the destruction to buildings here. I mean, this is what the war is doing to every neighborhood on the front lines. I thought that was pretty interesting to see that. So there you go. Right, I talked to you today in the update one, in the front lines one, about how there were sources, pro-Russian sources, that were yesterday claiming that Torska, Terny, Dubrova, Yempolovka, I think that's how you pronounce it, something like that, were taken over by the Russians in a counteroffensive, and they were therefore occupied, and well done, Russian forces and all that. And I was saying, well, there's no visual confirmation of this, and it's highly likely that this is not actually true, and that this is inflated. The question is, how does it get to this point? Is it just someone sits down and does a flat lie, or is this an incremental thing that happens? So that a Russian commander says, "Oh, we've reached, or we're shelling this place, we're harassing this settlement," and then that goes up one line of command, and it's like, "Oh, we've reached this place," and that becomes we've taken over this place, and that becomes, and the enemy have now lost a bunch of stuff. So by the time it gets to the top, they're like, "Oh, brilliant, we're doing really well here," etc., etc. And this goes on, week in, week out, and then the people at the top just have a completely distorted view of reality of actually what's going down at the bottom. And then a military blogger gets hold of some of this information. "Oh, we've taken this place," so then they report it and they put it on their maps, and they say Russians have taken this place, and this place. And of course, that has never happened. What's happened is the Russians have been shelling those places. So anyway, here is a guy from this is on Times Radio. He's with the United Services Institute in the UK. Justin Bronk, I think his name is.
This is a point of desperation for.
A really interesting little snippet on TikTok, but they've just cut this snippet to be the right amount of length. So hopefully enjoy.
For President Putin, he has clearly been receiving at best filtered reports of how badly things have been going in Ukraine. He's clearly aware that they're not going well. But given the fact that the Russian system is essentially built on an acceptance of lying and massaging figures, whether it be monetary figures or reports at every level, unit commanders will report that an exercise has been done, a training exercise has been done, partly to pocket the money that you would have spent on that training exercise, in many cases just do basic things like pay for accommodation and food. Then the people higher up will also report that exercise has been done, maybe pass on photos instead of an actual exercise, probably inflate the figures. And you're seeing the same at every level in Ukraine, where if a unit the folks on the ground go forward and they don't make any progress and they take a load of casualties, that Russian unit commander will often report that the position was successfully either reached or taken, and a couple of Ukrainian tanks were destroyed. Let's say 3 or 4 tanks were destroyed. But then his superior will report that not only was the position taken, but 10 Ukrainian tanks were destroyed, and there were limited losses on our side. And then you see at every point up the chain, by the time it gets to the senior level, their perspective on actually what the reality is on the front lines for their own forces is probably fairly distorted. But Putin is trying to sort of walk an almost impossible tightrope between the various different factions within Russia that he needs to keep on side, in effect. I mean, not necessarily on side, but at least keep passively supportive. Which is that the public are clearly that they're still talking about partial mobilization. They're saying that no students are going to be called up, and it's just going to be people with former military experience. Whether that's true or not in practice is very, very questionable. But clearly, they're scared of the public reaction from overtly saying we're going to go onto a full war footing and we're going to mobilize everybody. It's part of the long-term bargain that Putin struck with the Russian people, was that he would make Russia a great power, but they would be able to go about their lives as normal in the background. And you saw that, for example, one of the first things he did when he took power was to suspend large-scale conscription. It's part of the inherent bargain there. So he's trying to give the military what it desperately needs, but it's 6 months too late, which is enough manpower, or a source of manpower, to allow them to man this enormously long front line. It's still nearly 1,000 kilometers of front line, and to take these objectives, which even with the filtered information he has, he knows they're not taking. This is a point of desperation for President.
So I think that's pretty fascinating there, and it just has to be what's going on. The information that the decisions they're making are so poor that they are best explained by having very poor information, garbage in, garbage out, right? If you're if you're given a bunch of incorrect information, then the decision you'll make will be strategically poor and an incorrect decision, right? And they're making plenty of those decisions, so therefore they must have poor information, and people just aren't confident enough to give those in charge, because it's a case of shooting the messenger so often. I would imagine that, you know, if you give them bad information, you're for the high jump, so you give them good information, and then the people at the top then start making crazy decisions. Anyway, there you go. So moving on to, or back to this idea of precision munitions, let's concentrate on the Excalibur. So this is where the US have, over the last couple of decades, really been concentrating on the research and development of guided munitions. So these are artillery shells that can be fired out of a number of different artillery units or pieces of artillery, and with GPS can hit their targets with an incredible amount of accuracy. So that we talked about CEP, didn't we, last couple of days? So that's your circle or error probability, this kind of circle of accuracy that defines the precision of your munition. Something like a KH-22, I think I was talking about, had a CEP of 300 meters. So you're going to fire this cruise missile, and if 50% of them hit within 300 meters of where you want it to hit, then hey, that is precise. But to me, that's desperately imprecise. And what the US have been concentrating on is making their munitions far more precise, more and more precise. So this piece of munition is precise to a CEP of about 5 meters, but indeed in practice it's actually something like 2.5 meters. I'll show you some footage in a minute. It talks about sort of 4 meters or so, but as far as I can gather, actually there's 2.5 to 5 meter precision. So that is almost to a man, to a human. Like, that's how precise this is. And if you now, they are very much more expensive than dumb munitions, and Russia have dumb munitions by the bucket load, or at least have had during this war, and they've been firing dumb munitions and flattening places. So they don't want to spend all the money having stuff like this, because that's not part of their doctrine. Their doctrine is to flatten a town and then walk in afterwards, and there's nothing left of it. And it's like, yeah, we've liberated this town. It's like, no, you haven't. You've destroyed it, and you've walked into a bunch of rubble. Whereas the Ukrainians, considering these are their towns, they want to be hitting their targets with incredible precision. So they will want an absolute ton of these Excalibur projectiles, for example. There are other ones, but these are particularly good. So here is an interesting piece of footage. It shows the projectile being programmed with the GPS coordinates, and then put into the piece of artillery. And these bits here, so this is what they look like before they're fired, and after they're fired you get these fins that come out here. There are 4 fins that come out on the front, and then the fins will come out the back as well, and I'll show you a bit of footage of that in a second. So here he is. Yeah, I don't need the sound for that, so it's just music. So here he is, I think. Yeah. So here he is, plugging that in to the computer effectively. Then they whack it on a piece of artillery. It gets loaded on. It knows where it's going. Fire it in, pretty much, obviously accurately fire it to the place where you want it to go. It's not just like fire it up and then it goes on its own accord. You need to still make sure it's going where it should be, like a normal piece of ordnance. But you have the ability to then, alter its trajectory to some degree when it's in the air, or it will be finding its way in a fairly stable manner towards its target. And we'll just see this get fired off, and there you go. Bish bash bosh. Or maybe we won't. There we go. And there you go. And so that gets fired off and hits a place precisely. You don't have to spend, an hour sending up dozens of shells and wondering whether you're going to hit this thing or not. So this is a little bit of a video to explain to some degree the Excalibur GPS guided artillery shell. So Raytheon and BAE Systems. Raytheon took it on from, I think, a Swedish-American bit of research, and then they took it on and developed it.
Excalibur has a range of approximately 40 to 57 kilometers, 25 to 35 mi, depending on configuration, with a circular error probable.
So he says me there because I think it's an automated voice, so that's miles. So I'll just rewind that just so you can get the range correct.
With a circular error probable. Excalibur has a range of approximately 40 to 57 kilometers, 25 to 35 mi, depending on configuration, with a circular error probable, SEP, of around 5 meters, 16 feet, to 20 meters, 66 feet. The extended range is achieved through the use of folding glide fins, which allow the projectile to glide from the top of a ballistic arc towards the target. The Excalibur was first used operationally in Iraq in 2007. Its performance was impressive. The rounds proved to be extremely accurate with a SEP of just 5 meters. The Excalibur is compatible with 155mm artillery systems, such as USM 777 lightweight field howitzer, M109A6 Paladin and M109A7 self-propelled howitzers. It is also compatible with other 155mm artillery systems, such as German PZH-2000, South Korean K-9 Thunder, Japan's Type 99 and other 155mm artillery systems. The Excalibur has forward-folding fins. Due to its fin stabilization, this projectile has near pinpoint accuracy. The SEP is only 5 meters or even better. Operational experience in 2007 in Iraq revealed that 92% of the rounds are falling within 4 meters of the target. So just to go over that, we talked about how 50% of like caliber 20 KH-22 might fall within 300 meters of the target, and you got 92% of these falling within 4 meters of the target. I mean, that's and okay, this isn't a cruise missile, this is an artillery shell, but you can see how important that is. The Excalibur is extremely accurate. This gives it the ability to be safely delivered in much closer proximity to friendly troops or civilian structures than unguided projectile usually allows for. In fact, it can be used just 75 to 150 meters from friendly troops. This minimizes damage to friendly forces and various civilian structures.
That can't be overstated as an important point. So artillery generally can't support your own troops in an offensive capability or even defensive. You know, you've got to be aiming for stuff quite a long way away from your troops when you're using sort of indirect, unguided artillery munitions. But here you've got the ability to hit targets with such precision that you can actually use them much closer to your own troops, and that gives you a much greater range of the application of this. So there you go. This is right, another bit of munition. We're coming towards the end, so you know I won't keep you too long. Again, look at these pockmarked fields, really typical of the kind of views you see, the landscapes you see. So this is what looks like an ATGM, like an anti-tank munition being used, like a shoulder-held like javelin or something that's being used here. So have a look at this.
Когда мы начинаем действовать, они боятся. Они тоже хотят жить, понятно, но не на этой земле.
So you saw that one coming from the side there, and you're thinking, okay, look, there is the smoke coming from behind it. You're thinking, yeah, that's definitely someone just standing there with an anti-tank rocket launcher.
Когда мы начинаем действовать, они боятся.
But supposedly all of those are actually mines. And I talked to you the other day about how mines aren't just these days things that you put in a road or in a field and wait for something to drive over it. Actually, you can have a whole host of different mines. You can have mines that fire up, jumping mines that fire up and then come down on top of your vehicle. And you get mines like these. These are palm heap mines that are called off-route anti-tank mines. And they basically, you trigger the mine in lots of different ways. It can be acoustically triggered, like the sound of an engine, a particular sound will trigger it, or it could be going over a wire, the weight of a vehicle, so it won't go off. It's like someone on a bicycle or a car, but if you're a big old tank, then it will fire it off. And then these mines can also be set that they will deactivate within 40 days, so they are more humanitarian. Interesting, design features of these mines. So this one is something that looks like this, and we know that the Germans have provided, I think, maybe 2,000 of these. These are palm off-route anti-tank mines. It might be slightly different from the one that's mentioned there, DM22 heat, but you get the idea. And I'll just show you another little bit of that. So here, this is coming off from there. So is that a guy with a rocket launcher? And in fact, there's two. There's another one over there and here. And it appears that wasn't someone with a rocket launcher. That was an anti-tank mine being triggered off from the side of the road. And these are pretty clever, the DM12 heat off-road, and that was the DM22, the one that they said in that not the previous, but the one before video. Anti-tank mines, which can strike enemy vehicles with fin-stabilized rockets up to 100 meters away. So the Russians captured some of these, so they know they're being used against them. Delivery of these started taking place in 1991. So actually, these aren't new munitions. They've been around since the 80s. The German army has been developing these ones since the 80s. Palm 2 was a development of Palm 1, incorporating an infrared sensor and an improved rocket. So there's lots of tech involved in these things, mounted on a small tripod, allowing it to be traversed through 360 degrees and elevated up to 90 degrees and expressed to a 45-degree angle. The mine can, it's not great English, this is sort of translation. The mine can be established in more than 40 days. It will be used at the site. They will shut down. So that's what I'm saying. After 40 days, it kind of shuts down, but it's autonomous, so it works on its own, sensor controlled, and it can be enabled by perception of engine sound. That's the acoustic sensor, but also a cable, optical cable, and so on and so forth. So lots of ways that they can be triggered. The rocket has a velocity of approximately 120 meters per second and has claimed armor penetration of 600 millimeters. So that's 60 centimeters. So that's just really heavy bit of armor, and a shaped charge perforates conventional armor and ERA to a considerable extent. So ERA is that reactive armor, explosive reactive armor I talked about in a previous video. Anyway, really, really useful pieces of kit, and supposedly they're being evidenced. Now, this speech, the last thing, this is what I'm going to say. I would advise you reading this whole speech. There's too much for me to talk about, but it is massively interesting. So this is the EU Ambassadors Annual Conference 2022, opening speech by High Representative Joseph Borrell. And this will talk about things like China again, things about the geopolitics of not only the immediate region, but the whole world, and what is Europe doing about it. So it kind of sets it up like this. I want to structure my address today along two things. First, the what question. Second, the how questions. The what questions are, what is happening? What is coming? What should we do? The how questions are, how do we operate? How do we work? How do you work? How can we get more and better results? This is not a moment when we are going to send flowers to all of you saying you are beautiful, you work very well, and we are very happy. We are one big family, etc. This is a moment to talk among ourselves about what we do and not do well enough, and why I'm not always happy with the way my EU delegations work, and to send clear messages about how I would like you to improve. So this is to EU ambassadors. First, about the what, the world we are facing. As I said, I'm not a specialist on almost any of the issues, but I have a broad political understanding. How are we facing the world? What world is this? Well, it is a world of radical uncertainty. The speed and scope of change is exceptional. We should not try to deny it. We should try to resist it. It would be a futile effort. We have to accept it and to adapt to it, prioritizing flexibility and resilience. But uncertainty is the rule. Events that one could imagine that they will never happen, they're happening one after the other. At this pace, the black swan will be the majority. It will not be white swans. All of them will be black. This is to do with inductive reasoning, the fact that no black swans exist, and then they suddenly found black swans to exist. Bit of philosophy, actually. Because one after the other, things have happened that have that had a very low probability of happening. Nevertheless, they happened, and they had a strong impact, and certainly they happened. Let me try to summarize what is happening to us. Maybe I'm wrong, but I want to discuss with you about it. I think that we Europeans are facing a situation in which we suffer the consequences of a process that has been lasting for years, in which we have decoupled the sources of our prosperity from the sources of our security. This is a sentence to provide the headline, and I'm taking that from Oliver Schmidt, who has been developing the thesis, I think, quite well. Our prosperity has been based on cheap energy coming from Russia. Russian gas, cheap and supposedly affordable, secure and stable. It has been proved not to be the case. And the access to the big China market for exports and imports, for technological transfers, for investments, for having cheap goods. I think that the Chinese workers with their low salaries have done much better and much more to contain inflation than all the central banks together. So our prosperity was based on China and Russia, energy and market. Clearly today, we have to find new ways for energy from inside the European Union as much as we can, because we should not change one dependency for another. The best energy is the one you can produce at home. That will produce a strong restructuring of our economy, and that is for sure. People are not aware of that, but the fact that Russia and China are no longer the ones that they were for our economic development will require a strong restructuring of our economy. The access to China is becoming more and more difficult. The adjustment will be tough, and this will create political problems. On the other hand, we delegated our security to the United States. While the cooperation with the Biden administration is excellent, and the transatlantic relationship has never been as good as it is today, including our cooperation with the United States and my friend Tony Blinken, the US Secretary of State, we are in a fantastic relationship and cooperating a lot. Who knows what will happen 2 years from now, or even in November? So those who don't know, who aren't in America, November is the midterm elections. And if in the midterm elections the Republicans make a comeback and the Democrats lose control of the Senate, which is 50-50 at the moment, but they get the deciding vote with the vice president, so they have the Senate and they have the House quite comfortably, but they're looking to lose the House. They will possibly retain the Senate, probably retain the Senate, due to Republicans making some serious errors of judgment lately, politically speaking, and choosing some very bad candidates that were just the wrong choice of candidates. So, but if the GOP take control of the House, then you might get a political. So this is kind of what happened when Obama was in charge. For most of his 2 terms, he didn't control both houses. There wasn't this trifecta of the president, the House, the Senate, and the House of Representatives, right? And if you don't have all of those, you can't make decisions quickly and effectively, and you have to do bipartisan agreements. But both parties hate each other so much that they don't do bipartisan agreements very well at the moment. Republicans will just not support anything the Democrats say. So if Biden says, "I want to provide this amount of support for Ukraine," there's a strong chance that after November, or for Europe in this case, to do with Europe, then there's a very strong possibility that the Republican Party, if they take the House and more, will stop that from happening. So anyway, there you go, bit of explanation. What would have happened if, instead of Joe Biden, it would have been Donald Trump or someone like him in the White House? What would have been the answer of the United States to the war in Ukraine? What would have been our answer in a different situation? These are some questions that we have to ask ourselves, and the answer for me is clear. We need to shoulder more responsibilities ourselves. We have to take a bigger part of our responsibility in securing security. You, the United States, take care of our security. You, China and Russia, provided the basis of our prosperity. This is a world that is no longer there. Inside our countries, there's a radical shift. So this is talking about Italy now, one of the biggest economies in the world, has now shifted to the right. You've got a far-right party, a coalition of 3 far-right parties, or 2 far-right and 1 centre-right. In Hungary, you've got Viktor Orban. In Poland, even though they're dead against Russia, they are actually a far-right party. The Justice and Law Party is, in my opinion, not a good party outside of what they've done in Ukraine, which has been brilliant, but domestically, socially and economically, I don't think it's in a good place. And Sweden have just moved to the right. You got this real big move to the right in Europe, but it's interesting what he says about this, which is inside our countries, there's a radical shift, and the radical right is increasing in our democracies. Democratically, it is the choice of the people. It is not an imposition from any power. It is the people who go to vote here and there. I'm not going to blame anyone, but you have in mind what I am talking about. The radical right is increasing their grasp in European politics. So we have a difficult cocktail, internal and external, and the old recipes do not work anymore. We have a mounting security challenges and our internal cohesion is under threat. So let us look at the past few months in a little bit more detail. Anyway, I won't go on any further. It's just really fascinating and a really honest look at the issues that Europe have going forward. And this, and I love the fact he's talking about philosophers, talking about Kantians and Hobbesians. This is brilliant. And he'd already talked about black swans, which is inductive reasoning and philosophy. Anyway, I won't get ahead of myself. So he's talking about being much more proactive and not reactive, shaping things, economy and security, much more in advance, and having a really proactive approach to China and all of this stuff. Really interesting speech. Anyway, check it out. Let me know what you think. Sorry, I've been banging on too long. I hope you've enjoyed some of the things I talked about. Let me know. And I look forward to your comments. Thank you for your time. Please like, subscribe, share, all that stuff, as I always say, because otherwise I wouldn't be able to do this. And your thanks is really appreciated, especially if you can join the channel. And there is a PayPal and Buy Me a Coffee and thanks. The YouTube thanks, all you're able to find that details in the comments or down below the video. But if you just watch, that's awesome. Thank you for your time. Goodbye.